really don't get many opportunities to wear my short-sleeved Christmas t-shirt because it's very rarely hot enough around Christmas time for me to justify wearing it. But today, it's hot. And that's the UK for you, really. It can just randomly, in the middle of Advent, suddenly become t-shirt weather. Now, it's not in the middle of Advent right now because I'm recording these videos in advance, as I mentioned before. But still, the point remains. I do remember one Christmas, I literally did go for a walk outside wearing a t-shirt. That was actually the first time I remember really not enjoying Christmas because, yeah, I like it to be a little bit cold. I like Christmas to be cozy. This was literally, it was a hot Christmas and I did not enjoy it at all. So this video is going to be quite an interesting one and quite a significant one in that it's going to be me elucidating a pretty substantial economic thesis and one which I think very much puts me at odds with a lot of contemporary leftist thought. So look forward to that. So in my video on the environment, I made a joke that there are lots of leftists who basically want to blame a maximum of 5 people for all of the problems in the world. You know, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, they just want them to be responsible for all the problems in the world and essentially argue that if these people weren't so greedy and didn't have so much money, then it's as if every single problem in the world would be solved. And while I kind of said that off the cuff as a joke, it's now become my go-to way of explaining why it is that there is this prevailing thought in contemporary socialism that I totally disagree with. And it's this idea that the enemy is just the super richest people and that people always, or lots of socialists nowadays seem to be characterizing their objection to capitalism and their issues with capitalism in terms of these just super rich, 5 people maximum who, like I say, if they just weren't so rich, all the problems in the world would suddenly be fixed. And I just think that's ridiculous. I think it's incredibly far from the truth. So a lot of people don't seem to understand what wealth is. Owen Jones famously got absolutely destroyed by Andrew Neil because, and this isn't a credit to Andrew Neil, but it's really just an issue for Owen Jones because Owen Jones confused net worth and wealth with income. Basically, Owen Jones said that there are a significant number of people in Parliament who earn £1 million a year, when what he actually meant, or rather what the actual reality of the situation is that there are a large number of people in Parliament who have £1 million. They are worth £1 million. And it's worth bearing in mind, I think the significance of being a millionaire is often overstated. For example, if you just own a decent house in a decent area, you could, just based on those 2 criteria, be a millionaire. Because there are lots of places, particularly in the UK, in a lot of the time the southern UK, southern England, where there are houses which are good, they're nice houses, certainly I think most people would be lucky to live in them, but they're not huge, insane, incredible houses. However, because they're in the center of a major town or city, and it's quite a pretty town or city, actually they go for £1 million just on their own. So sure, if you initially buy it, you're probably going to be getting a mortgage or something like that. But all you need to do is pay off that mortgage. And once you've paid off that mortgage, you're a millionaire. It's also entirely possible that you may have actually got the house when it was significantly cheaper, in which case, just based on change in property prices, you have become a millionaire. So while we can talk about millionaires as this, big kind of implying some huge degree of luxury, actually it can just be owning a decent house in a decent area. And this is particularly something worth bearing in mind when you talk about politicians being millionaires. It's often, people do like to stress that fact of, oh, look at this huge proportion of politicians who are millionaires. But actually, when you think about it, it's because a lot of them are going to own houses in the center of a capital city. And actually plenty of those houses, even if they're just remotely decent houses, are going to cost £1 million or be worth £1 million simply because of location. So while I'm not denying that this speaks to some disparity, the disparity is really just owning a decent house in a decent area. And, certainly there are lots of people in the north where houses are significantly cheaper who own houses that are very nice, and just because of the area they live in, it's not worth as much. And, I'm certainly aware of lots of northerners who I just know personally who have houses where if that house was down where I live, it would cost £600,000-700,000. But because it's up where, the house prices aren't as high, it's worth 300,000-400,000. That's a significant difference. So obviously Owen Jones confusing the amount of money you have with your annual income is pretty silly, but it's also worth noting that you see this much more commonly with people talking about, for example, Bill Gates and how Bill Gates has all of this money. And I think a very common thing you hear is, for example, Bill Gates could solve world hunger. Sometimes they even add other things on top of that. Bill Gates could solve world hunger. He could solve world thirst. He could educate the entire world. And while he's at it, he could turn every single electricity grid in the world to 100% renewable. And he would still be a multi-billionaire. That's a thing you hear a lot, which sounds, oh wow, that's incredible. Come on, let's just limit Bill Gates to £1 billion, or $1 billion if you like, and suddenly let's fix all of these problems. So suddenly the world can be a complete post-scarcity utopia. And of course, it seems to be assuming that Bill Gates just has this money lying around like in a bank account. Like, people seem to think a lot of the time when they hear this person is worth X number of £1 billion, that's like their bank account balance, rather than being what it actually is, of course, which is an expression of the perceived value of the company they own. Bill Gates doesn't have £1 billion in the bank account. He can't go to, I don't know, wherever, HSBC, whatever, and withdraw £1 billion and be like, oh, finally, I just realized I can solve world hunger with this £1 billion I just have lying around. And how evil of it was Bill Gates not to realize he could just solve world hunger just by going to the bank and taking out a fraction of the income he has, or, you know, not income, sorry. Oh, look, here's me doing it now. What am I, Owen Jones? Of the wealth that he has in the bank. Just go take it out. Obviously completely ridiculous. It's actually just that he owns a company, and that company is perceived to be worth, like, if you wanted to buy Microsoft, it would cost billions of pounds. So if you wanted to buy Microsoft, it would cost billions of pounds. Bill Gates owns Microsoft, so Bill Gates owns, in effect, billions of pounds. He owns something which is valued at billions of pounds. But he doesn't just have billions of pounds lying around in a bank account that he can just take out, like liquid cash, that he can just take out and just use to solve all of the world's problems. Now you might say, okay, yeah, sure, but Bill Gates, he still owns the company, so why doesn't he just sell the company to convert it to cash, to convert the value of that company to cash, and then he could solve all of the world's problems? Which sounds on the surface, maybe a bit reasonable, but then you have to realize the fact that nobody has that amount of money. There's nobody in the world who has £1 billion in the bank. 0 people. Like, even if you wanted to get like a different billionaire to do it, okay, you could get, for example, Jeff Bezos. Okay, he doesn't have billions of pounds in the bank, but he has Amazon. So maybe Jeff Bezos says, okay, tell you what, Bill Gates, we'll swap. I'll buy Microsoft with the value of Amazon, and then, we'll just split the difference somehow. Yeah, that could happen. But then actually what you'll notice is that no cash has actually swapped hands there. It's not as if there's now suddenly cash lying around, which Bill Gates, I guess I could, you get what I'm saying. Nobody has billions of pounds in cash that they can give to Bill Gates. So Bill Gates can't just sell Microsoft and solve all of the world's problems. Now, obviously, there is that much money in the economy. For example, governments actually have that amount of money. Governments have the authority to pay civil service workers and other government workers actual literal billions of pounds every year, and that money goes into a bank account. People every payday, every single government worker looks, and the government has effectively, obviously I realize it's more convoluted than this, but in effect the government has transferred an amount of money, probably over £1,000, into that person's bank account. And actually, the reality is, yes, the government has billions of pounds which it can transfer into people's bank accounts. So within that context, sure, the government, for example, could buy Microsoft. So if you really thought, Bill Gates, he is, it's a real problem that Bill Gates is a billionaire, because he could solve all the world's problems, couldn't he? So maybe you say, okay, what if Bill Gates sells Microsoft, and he can't sell it to an individual because there's no individual with that money, but he sells it to the government. And that way the government could buy it, and Bill Gates could take his billions of pounds that he's now got, and he can distribute that to all of the different people he needs to solve world hunger. Or alternatively, you could say, well, actually, no, maybe what he could do is he could split Microsoft up into like shares. So every single person can own a little bit of it and he can just sell it to the masses. So it's like, he sells on Microsoft and then it becomes Microsoft is owned by like, 1 million people, but each of those 1 million people spent like £10,000 and now they all own 1/1,000,000th of Microsoft and Bill Gates now has £10 billion. Which, to be honest, I almost think that's less than Microsoft is worth, but I'm not totally sure. So let's just say that it's well, accurate. So Bill Gates has £10 billion. And finally, now, he can solve world hunger. He can do it. He's got the money in the bank account. 1,000, and that, I mean, that is true. Yeah, sure. If 1,000 people with 10,000, and you know, people do have like £10,000 in their bank account. You know, not every person, but it is a thing. It's not inconceivable someone could have that much. So sure, you could have 1 million people transfer. Are there 1 million people with 10,000? Okay, I think, yeah, let's say there are. So you could have 1 million people transfer £10,000 into one person's bank account, and then that person would finally have the, you know, what every socialist dreams of, one person with £10 billion in their bank account. They go to the ATM and they click check account balance and it says £10 billion. And finally, we can now say, yes, Bill Gates, you now need to go out and fulfill your obligation to solve world hunger. But here's the thing. When you actually consider that, you're like, well, couldn't these people just solve world hunger anyway? Like, what's actually the point? If you're going to say that 1 million people should give £10,000, why don't they just give £10,000 to charity and solve world hunger? You know, what's the point? If you're saying like, oh, actually, yeah, we can get some money, or if you're going to say the government should give this money, why doesn't the government just give the money directly to solve world hunger? Like, sure, you could say that Bill Gates could sell Microsoft, and in doing so, reduce his own net worth by giving away all of the money that he makes from selling Microsoft in this very convoluted process. But what's actually the point in that, right? Like, essentially, this is all just to try and get around the fact that Bill Gates doesn't actually have that much money that he can just convert into using to solve world hunger. The massive issue here is that money as a expression of the perceived value of the assets and indeed companies that an individual might own doesn't really interface with money as a facilitator of the exchange of goods and services. The two things really don't interact with each other at all. So actually, Bill Gates having billions of pounds of money in the sense of it being an expression of the perceived value of the company he owns doesn't actually give him the ability to use that money to command billions of pounds worth of goods and services, because the two things don't interface. And I guess if I was going to give, you know, like call something in as my thesis statement, well, that would probably be one of those things. These two ways of money existing and being spoken about don't interface with each other. The owning of a massive multi-billion-dollar company does not translate to the ability to just command billions of dollars worth of goods and services, you know, by just paying for it with the money out of your bank account. And my basic argument in this video is that capitalist exploitation is really more about money in the latter sense than the former sense. It's not really about people owning these billion-dollar companies. It's about the relationship between the laborers and the goods and services they produce. So when I was first talking about this with somebody, I gave an analogy, and I will now present that analogy to you. Imagine there is a plumber, and we'll call him Dean. And this plumber decides to go to work for himself. He has a van, and he owns his van, and he starts working. And eventually he decides to actually have his own company. Well, I think he kind of needs to if he's self-employed. So he calls the company Dean's Plumbing Limited. Now, what he decides to do is he actually ends up saying that other people can work for his company. Other plumbers can work for his company. And he basically says the rule in this company is everything you earn from your work as a plumber, you keep. You work as a plumber, and obviously you need to pay for any of the materials you need, but every single bit that you get paid based on how much you charge as a plumber, you keep. And this applies to Dean himself. Dean says, while I own this company, I'm not going to ask that the money goes up to me and I distribute it to you as a wage. Rather, my wage is going to be the money that I make from continuing to work as a plumber. So Dean decides to just keep working as a plumber for Dean's Limited, even while he's the owner of the company. Now, eventually, more and more people, let's say, for example, that this company gets a reputation for just doing really good work. Dean is, let's say, very selective with the plumbers he takes on. And the result of that is people start saying, hey, if you want plumbing done, you need to get Dean's Limited on the job. So Dean's Limited starts getting more and more work. And eventually, it works out that every single plumber who's good at their job recognizes that, if I want people to see that I'm good at my job, I need to work for Dean's Limited, because Dean's Limited is a sign of quality. It's almost like a certification. It's, I work for Dean's Limited. You know that I'm going to do a good job. And Dean obviously is very strict about, saying you can only work for this company if you do a really good job. And again, even as the company grows, he keeps the same rule. He says, well, look, my wage is just going to be what I earn from the plumbing work I do. And everyone else's wages are going to be exactly the same. Essentially, it's you'll work for the company, but ultimately, the only wages that are going to be, earned are just the wages from your work in the company. And eventually, this idea becomes so popular that Dean thinks, actually, he gets a message from a French plumber and a German plumber and even an Italian plumber who's got a princess that's gone missing. And they start saying, hey, your plumbing company is internationally renowned. Everyone recognizes it. So we would like to actually get on board with this. We want a Dean's Limited Italy, Dean's Limited France, Dean's Limited Germany, Dean's Limited America. And it gets to a point where it just becomes known that, hey, you want some jobs done with your plumbing? Dean's Limited. What you could probably imagine, if you're already thinking about this, is that actually Dean's Limited is going to become, as it becomes the largest plumbing company in the world, is also going to become incredibly valuable. It's going to become a multi-billion dollar company because of how valuable it is, because of the fact it's literally the number one plumbing company in the world. And it's bringing in huge amounts of money. And yet, well, okay, let's just stress one point. So what would this make Dean? Dean owns Dean's Limited Plumbing Company, or Dean's Plumbing Limited, whatever I said it was. He owns the company. The company's worth billions of dollars. So, what's Dean? He's a multi-billionaire. But, is he exploiting anybody? No, he's not, is he? All the money he makes as the owner of the company is from his work as a plumber. He's just doing his work. And I mean, the thing is, even if you started saying, and I should clarify this, you might say, okay, well, actually, no, because other things need doing. Like, eventually this company is going to want, for example, a receptionist and stuff like that. Okay, so you could have a system where every single person pays essentially, if you almost like a progressive taxation or something, or a flat tax, either way, it doesn't matter. But basically a proportion of the wealth that these people earn, or a proportion of the wages from everybody goes up to the company, and that is then distributed to the receptionist and whoever else it is that you need to be in charge of these things. But within that context, again, there's no exploitation there, is there? All the money that Dean's making, every single bit of Dean's income is coming from his work. And if anything, he's giving up his money, from this, taxation thing that I'm allowing for, or this idea of like, well, you kick some of the money up to just help with the running of the company. He's giving up that, along with everyone else. What you should notice here is there is no exploitation happening. Every bit of money, and certainly the money that when Dean checks his bank account, every bit of money in that bank account is money he earned through his hard work and his labor. However, he's also a multi-billionaire. He's a multi-billionaire because he owns this huge company, this multi-billion-dollar company. And what this shows, I think, is obviously you might say, well, this is just a hypothetical, obviously. And that's true, it is a hypothetical. But it shows that, at least in theory, and demonstrates, I think, quite clearly, there is no relationship between being exploitative and owning a multi-billion-dollar company, and hence being a multi-billionaire. I think actually it's pretty unambiguous there, and it shows quite clearly, how these two things don't interface. The money that's talking about the exchange of goods and services, the money that these plumbers get paid for their services they provide, and the money that they can then take out from their account to buy goods and services for themselves, there's no exploitation happening there. Absolutely zero. And also the money which Dean owns, which is an expression of the value of his company, the multi-billions of pounds owned there, is also not exploitative. So ultimately you can see from this that somebody can be a multi-billionaire and not be exploitative. And like I say, you may say, oh, well, it's just a hypothetical, but if you're, ultimately theories need to be able to account for hypotheticals, especially seeing as while this is a hypothetical, it's actually possible, I would argue. I don't think there's any reason why this is impossible to happen in reality. And I would argue that it kind of is possible in reality and has sort of happened in reality, kind of, not in this specific way. But I want to talk about J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling is incredibly rich. Very, very, very rich. Now, here's the thing. Is J.K. Rowling exploitative? Well, maybe you could say that actually some of the goods that are produced that actually create value from the Harry Potter franchise, or for the Harry Potter franchise, is exploitative. But ultimately, what you have to recognize is that actually J.K. Rowling is worth as much money as she is because she owns the Harry Potter Wizarding World franchise. And this franchise is the direct result of her creative, intellectual, and also, physical labor when she was living off benefits in Scotland. She was not wealthy when she did all this, and yet it's everything that she has now is as a result of that labor. Ultimately, therefore, the worth of J.K. Rowling now is not an expression of some kind of exploitation that's happening of other people's labor. It's a representation of the value of her labor in terms of the intellectual property she created. Now, sure, you could have a moral critique of intellectual property in general, and that's fine. That's a whole other topic. But the point is that you can't say J.K. Rowling is exploitative because she has... I actually think I've heard that J.K. Rowling is not a billionaire. But so let's just, just to avoid possibly being inaccurate, she has hundreds of millions of pounds. And because of that, she's exploitative. It's like, well, no, actually, the real reason she has that money, sure, maybe you could say some of that money is increased by exploitative business practices, because of course, yes, it is true that exploitative business practices can increase a company's profit, which can in turn increase a company's perceived value. And therefore, for example, if there's some company which makes Harry Potter toys and they charge the people who make those toys, or rather pay the people who make those toys, pittance, and basically completely exploit them, well, that will increase the profits of that company, which will in turn increase the perceived value of that company, and that will in turn increase the perceived value of the Harry Potter franchise as a whole. But ultimately, the real reason why the Wizarding World franchise is worth a huge amount of money is because people like the films, they like the stories, they like the premise, they like the concept. Everything which J.K. Rowling came up with, like I say, when she was living off benefits, in not a particularly well-off situation. So what you have here is, I think, actually and I think you can apply it more generally to creative things. You recognize that actually it's just a very obvious example of how the value of an individual or the worth of an individual is not an expression of exploitative business practices. It's an expression of perceived value of what they own. And of course, for example, if the Harry Potter franchise was not considered particularly impressive, or that many people were particularly enthusiastic about it, well, J.K. Rowling would be worth substantially less money. That's the point. It's not about how exploitative she is or isn't. The Harry Potter franchise could be considered to be worth many, many times more, and she wouldn't be any more exploitative, and it could be considered to be worth many, many, many times less, and she wouldn't be any less exploitative. So it just is another example. Obviously, I had my hypothetical, which I think really just shows how extreme it can get, where you can just have like no exploitation at all. But I think this is an example of, even where I think there probably is some exploitation, I don't think that actually the exploitation relates very much to the overall worth of J.K. Rowling. So let's unpack some implications. The first is that I am obviously very, very, very skeptical of this nonsense claim that the problem with the world is these multi-billionaires who own huge amounts of money. I think that's complete nonsense. I think it's bogus socialism, and I just don't think it's particularly intelligent, clever. There's nothing good I can say about this take of like, oh, it's just these 5 billionaires, and if we just took some of Bill Gates' money, we could solve all the world's problems. Don't agree with that at all. So for me, what I'm interested in really is money as it relates to goods and services. Money as it relates to the amount of money in your bank account and what you can do with it. And ultimately what this means is that I'm sure not hugely into the super rich, but it's worth noting that I'm just as bothered by, say, for example, Leonardo DiCaprio, who can buy a huge yacht and live in a massive mansion, as I am about Jeff Bezos, who can do all of those things, but just also happens to be worth billions of pounds because of a company he owns. Like, when you actually look at the lifestyles of these individuals, really, there's not much difference between people who are only worth a few million, but that million actually amounts to real cash money they can spend, and people who are worth billions, but of which only millions is what they can actually spend. That what I think matters is how much money can these people spend, and what are they doing with that money. So yeah, that's why, for example, I don't think obsessing over what the people who are worth billions can do is really worthwhile. I think, well, let's look at the people who are worth millions, but it's money they're actually spending, and they're not choosing to spend it on making the world a better place. They're choosing to spend it on mansions, on cars, on pointless, collector antiques, on yachts, on, caviar and all that kind of stuff. But I would also say that let's not ignore the fact that in the grand scheme of the world, these people who own all of these incredibly eccentric things, it's not that many people. And it's not actually, the problem is this robs people of the fantasy that the world can be solved just by targeting a few individuals. Because actually, when you're talking about this money, sure, it's incredibly decadent, but you can't solve world hunger for the price of a yacht. You can't solve world hunger for the price of many yachts. You can't continue to indulge in this fantasy that the only problem with the world is these super, super rich people who just live beyond what's, necessary. You need to recognize the problem is with loads of other people who also live beyond what's necessary. Basically, the middle class. It's the people who own 2 or 3 cars. The people living in the kind of muck mansions. It's the people, it's desperate housewives, right? Like, the people who just have these absurdly large houses when there are hardly anybody, there is hardly anybody living in them. People owning multiple cars, people owning multiple different PlayStation or gaming consoles, and it's like there are people starving. Let's stop acting as if the problem is just people owning yachts. There are people starving, and yet there are people who own a PlayStation, an Xbox, and a Nintendo gaming system. There are people who own multiple cars. There are people who have multiple reception rooms downstairs. They have the study, they have the lounge, they have a conservatory, they have a dining room, they have a kitchen, and then on top of that, they also have like a second reception room. Simpsons is a good example. It's Simpsons. Their house is big. Remember when Frank Grimes says, "This place is a palace," and it's like I love that. I love it so much because I think Frank Grimes is more right than he realizes when he says that. And I think what he's recognizing in that moment is that the problem isn't this tiny proportion of people who own yachts and mansions and all this kind of stuff. It's this huge number of people who own a house with 2 reception rooms. Like how the Simpsons, they have the lounge, and then they just have like a random room at the front with a piano. And then they've got a dining room and a kitchen, and they have a rumpus room too, a rumpus room in the back. And there are people starving in the world. And if you don't recognize that in a world where there are people starving, it is a problem that there are people who have 3 reception rooms in their house, that it is a problem that there are people who have 2 or 3 cars in their driveway, that it's a problem that there are people who have massive gardens just because it looks nice. If you are, and you think instead that the problem is with, never mind if you think the problem is with this tiny proportion of people who own yachts and mansions and all that kind of stuff. I don't think you know what you're talking about. If you think the problem is with like these 5 guys who own these companies that are worth billions of dollars, I don't think you have any idea what you're talking about. And I think the level of kind of ignorance to what the actual problem is with distribution, economic distribution in this economic system is, I think it speaks to quite possibly even a moral failing, not to recognize that is the problem with our society. It's not the people who have billions of dollars while some people are starving. It's the people who have 3 reception rooms while people are starving. Far more like, what is a reception room? It's literally just a room that's the definition of a reception room. It's just a room you sit in. And I just want to stress, I say all of this because this is, it depends how you define me. I don't own my own house. I haven't even left my parents' house, but I am in my parents' house. We have 3 reception rooms and a study. And by the way, one of our rooms, we call it the room that has no name. And we call it the room that has no name because we don't even have a purpose for that room. How insane is that? There are people in the world starving and we've got a room and we just don't know what to call it. It's literally just a room. Right now it's just like a room that's just got storage in it for like stuff we just own that we don't have anywhere to put it. And, my grandparents on one side of my family have a room called the quiet room. And it's like, that's the thing. I feel like that's one of the, that's just such a insane aspect of kind of middle class life. Just having these rooms and just giving them like these weird names because they're not, you've just made them up, Like you've just decided, oh yeah, we're going to put all of this effort into heating and lighting and, building this room. It doesn't even have a name, doesn't even have a purpose, or like if it does have a name, it's just like, it's the quiet room. It's just the room where you go to be quiet. It's really insane to me. And it's with all this in mind, I really hate people who don't want there to be really high taxes. I am mad for taxes. And I want taxes to hit the middle class hard. That's what I want. And that's the thing. I think a lot of people are so on the opposite. Lots of people who claim to be socialist are so on the opposite end of this. They're like, no. The middle class, they don't need to pay more taxes. No, the middle class. No, everyone, obviously the people who have all of these excessive luxuries, excessive space, excessive room, excess everything. No, they don't need to be paying more taxes. They're the victims. The only people who need to be paying more taxes are these super rich people. Because yeah, if you just tax them loads, that will fix all the world's problems. And it's like, no, if you actually care about solving the world's problems, then economic redistributive justice needs to hit the middle class hard. And people who are middle class, whether it's, obviously I rose for a lot of millennials, they're not exactly, and kind of Gen Zs, not exactly middle class necessarily in the situation they're at now, but they are quite likely to become so in the future, maybe. It kind of varies, but ultimately, the point is, whoever you are, if you recognize or if you do have these this excess of everything, then you need to recognize that excess is not moral in a world where there is so much poverty. And to say, oh, actually, no, my excess is fine. It's the excess of this tiny minority of people. They're the problem. I just think is very ridiculous, and I don't agree with it at all. And yeah, I wish that it was more kind of politically viable to just say like, no, I want to hit the middle class of this country hard with taxes. I wish that was the thing you could say, because it's what I genuinely believe. I would not. I don't think I'd make a good politician, because yeah, I just like, I want the middle class to be worse off because I think that their excess is immoral. No. I think ultimately what I don't like is decadence. And I realized recently, there's lots of controversial opinions I have, especially in terms of like optics. And something I was thinking about recently is that I realized I like the label Puritan. I'm quite proud of it, which, it sort of makes sense because I'm a kind of evangelical of sorts. But I was watching a thing by Adam Ragusa about cider in America. And he was talking about how cider was English. It's a kind of English drink. And how obviously in America, cider doesn't imply alcoholic content. And he basically pointed out that also, so he basically was saying how cider, the drink we get from England, or rather England, the place from which we get cider, is also the place from which Americans got the puritanical aversion to drinking. And therefore it's not necessarily surprising that in America, cider came to mean a non-alcoholic drink, because that's what the Puritans who brought cider would eventually come to agree with. And I found myself thinking, yes, I love England, because I love that those Puritans came from there, and they recognize the decadence, the debauchery of alcohol. That they recognize that this is a problem with the world. And it's like whenever people talk about like how the Puritans ruined Christmas and stuff, because it used to just be this massive celebration where everyone would just get drunk and go out on the streets and party, and the Puritans decided, no, let's make it be a kind of more modest affair without all of this excess and stuff like that. It's supposed to make the Puritans look bad. I'm just like, yes, I love it. I don't know whether I'd necessarily call myself a Puritan, but I definitely think I share a very pronounced Puritan ethic when it comes to my sense of like my belief about how is the right way to live. I'm not a hardcore aestheticist. I don't think people should abandon all property or anything like that, but I think I am very much against the decadence and excess of a great deal of the modern Western world. And I strongly feel that, yes, we need to curtail it. And we need to do that in order to fulfill, of course, apart from anything else, the other Christian ethic, which is charity, which is, you don't, when people are starving, you don't just let them starve. You certainly don't buy another car, just, I don't know what, so you can go to the gym while your wife's out grocery shopping. I'm not sure. You don't need to do that. You need to actually, and ultimately I want to stress, okay, I'm not somebody who, I'm a collectivist. That's the important thing. So I don't think this is like a case of some individual person needs to, and I guess this is, of course, well, that's the other point as well. As a collectivist, I'm automatically suspicious of this idea of like, oh, Bill Gates is the one person who needs to solve world hunger or something like that. No, I'm a collectivist, and I actually, think that we need to have a government that's going to curtail and curb our excesses and our decadence for the greater good, especially of those who are suffering tremendously due to what they lack. That's my belief. And, I relate it to Puritanism simply because I think it's funny to me that lots of people think the Puritan objection to kind of decadence and excess was in some way objectionable. And I'm just like, no, yes, I love it. And, overall, I mean, they're classic. I don't know. I maybe it's just because sometimes I can be a bit, as every Englishman should be. It's hard not to be occasionally quite enthusiastic for so much of the great things that England has given the world, and one of those things is certainly hardcore puritanical sensibilities. The best thing, and I think we can all agree with that. But the conclusion. Firstly, I always just feel like it's worth going back to, especially seeing as this is at a time where I'm in the background working on kind of this idea of like, are gender critical people left wing or right wing? I just think it's always worth stressing, like, boy, am I a hardcore kind of collectivist. And I'm kind of enjoying knowing that in a world full of kind of like fake socialists, fake, like people who present themselves as left wing, I don't think there can be any doubt from the sincerity of how I talk about this issue that I'm somebody who actually takes it seriously. And when I kind of, talk about capitalism, I'm not, one of those like left tube YouTubers who pays people to do all the work for me and then just makes money off of it or whatever else. I hope that you can recognize my sincerity on this topic. The other thing is, of course, I disagree profoundly with a lot of so-called socialists, particularly on this idea of it being the 1% that's the big problem. I just think that's nonsense. And I guess the other issue is that, or the final point is, I don't even know to what extent this is like an ideological disagreement. Like, in some sense, I feel like I'm saying all of this and it kind of makes me seem quite ideologically different from a lot of the prevailing kind of socialism that you see being espoused on Twitter and things like that. Like if you went onto like the late stage capitalist subreddit, I'm sure that you would see people saying things that would all be very much contrary to what I'm talking about. But the reality is that I'm not sure to what extent this actually is an ideological difference and to what extent it's just a difference in kind of like knowledge. Like I actually think that if these people who talk about how it's the billionaires who are just, they have all this money and if they could just, they could solve all the world problems and they're choosing not to. If people could realize that that's not true, or, if people were confronted with the reality that's not true, at that point it would be up to them whether or not they want to allow themselves to recognize that, yes, the problem is much broader than that and the solutions need to be applied much more broadly. And I think that's really what separates the sincere socialist, collectivist, whatever else you want to say, from the fakes. Anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope you found it interesting. I think maybe if you are somebody who didn't necessarily agree with me on this at the beginning and have changed your mind, I hope you don't feel like I was like going too hard on you for your previous, opinion or whatever. like maybe you're somebody who did before this think like, oh wait, no, Bill Gates, he can just solve all the world's problems. And I hope now you might see that's not true, and that it's actually kind of a silly way of looking at the world. If you do still disagree, well, it's possible that you disagree with me because you're actually kind of just a right-wing person, or like at least kind of like a Blairite liberal, like somebody who doesn't really agree with my whole broader collectivist mindset. In which case, that's fine. If you're somebody who's like, no, actually, I'm left-wing, I'm really socialist, really hardcore, and I still do think that we just need Bill Gates to, like give up some of his money and then he can solve world hunger and still be a billionaire. If you're someone who still thinks that, I don't know, watch the video again. Anyway, that's the end. Bye.